When the Dutch founded New Amsterdam in 1624, they did not build a city for comfort. They built a trading post. The Dutch West India Company controlled the land, the work, and the rules. Profit came first. Families came second. Poor families arrived early. Many came from the Netherlands, Germany, Scandinavia, and parts of France. Some were fleeing war. Some were escaping debt. Some were sent by the company itself. They arrived with little money and few tools. Many had no clear plan. The land was harsh. Winters were long. Summers were humid. Food could fail. Shelter took time to build. The forest had to be cleared by hand. Poor families worked from dawn until dark. Housing was fragile. Most early homes were wooden huts. Roofs leaked. Walls let in wind. Fire was a constant danger. One spark could destroy several homes. Wealthy traders lived closer to the fort. Poor families lived farther out, near marshes or rocky ground. Food was uncertain. Bread came from grain shipments. Meat came from hunting or small farms. Fish helped many families survive. The Hudson River provided fish, but nets cost money. Poor families used hooks and lines. Hunger was common in bad seasons. Work was unstable. The Dutch West India Company paid wages late or not at all. Laborers worked on docks, roads, and walls. Women worked as washerwomen, seamstresses, or sellers of small goods. Children worked early. Many began labor before age 10. Debt followed families quickly. Store owners extended credit at high rates. When crops failed or illness struck, families fell behind. Courts enforced debts harshly. Property could be seized. Some families lost their homes. Illness spread fast. Clean water was scarce. Waste flowed into streets. Smallpox outbreaks struck New Amsterdam several times in the 1600s. Poor families suffered most. They lived close together. They lacked medical care. Relief existed, but it was limited. The Dutch Reformed Church provided aid to its members. Church deacons collected donations. They gave bread, fuel, or small sums of money. Help depended on moral judgment. Those seen as lazy were denied aid. Orphans were common. Parents died from illness or accidents. Orphaned children were placed with families as servants. This was legal and common. Children worked in exchange for food and shelter. Many never received schooling. Widows faced harsh conditions. Without a male wage earner, survival became harder. Some remarried quickly. Others ran small businesses. A few kept taverns or boarding houses. Many relied on church charity. Enslaved Africans arrived in New Amsterdam by 1626. They worked for the Dutch West India Company. They built roads, walls, and farms. Some lived with their families. Others were separated. Though enslaved, their labor shaped the city. A small number of enslaved Africans received half freedom in the 1640s. They paid annual fees and worked when called. They owned small plots of land north of the town. These families lived in poverty but created communities. Their land later became part of the city's northern boundary. Native Lenape people lived nearby. Some traded with settlers, others lost land through violence or broken agreements. Poor settlers sometimes competed with native families for food and space. Conflict harmed both groups. In 1643, Director Willem Kieft launched a violent campaign against nearby native groups. This led to Kieft's War. Farms were destroyed, settlers fled. Poor families lost homes and food stores. Many faced starvation. The war showed how fragile life was. Wealth offered some protection. Poverty offered none. After the war, Peter Stuyvesant became director in 1647. He tried to impose order. He repaired defenses and enforced laws. He also tightened control over the poor. Begging was restricted. Idle people could be punished. Authorities believed poverty came from bad behavior. This belief shaped policy for decades. Stuyvesant ordered poor people to work. Those without jobs were assigned labor. Refusal brought punishment. This system helped the city but trapped families in low pay. Women faced strict rules. Unmarried mothers were fined or jailed. Their children were placed with other families. Poverty deepened shame. Taverns became places of survival. Some poor families ran small taverns. Alcohol sales provided income. Authorities monitored these spaces closely. Fines were common. Firewood was vital. Poor families gathered wood outside town. This took time and risk. Winter deaths were common when wood ran out. By the early 1660s, New Amsterdam had about 1,500 residents. A large share lived near poverty. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of merchants and officials. In 1664, the English seized the city without bloodshed. New Amsterdam became New York. For poor families, little improved. New rulers kept many Dutch laws. Poverty remained a constant. The English promised stability. They delivered taxes. Poor families paid rent to landlords. Land ownership became harder. English law favored property holders. Tenants had few rights. Church aid continued but did not expand. English churches followed similar moral rules. Help depended on obedience and reputation. Poor children continued to work. Apprenticeships offered skills but also exploitation. Many apprentices lived harsh lives. By the end of the 1600s, poverty was no longer temporary. It became structural. Families were born into it. Escape was rare. This shows a hard truth. Poverty did not arrive after New York grew. Poverty arrived with New York itself. The city learned early how to use poor labor. It also learned how to blame the poor for their condition. When the English renamed New Amsterdam as New York in 1664, the city did not reset, it tightened. The streets stayed narrow, the houses stayed crowded, the poor stayed poor. What changed was control. Under English rule, New York grew faster. Trade expanded. Ships arrived from England, the Caribbean, and other colonies. Sugar, rum, wheat, and furs moved through the harbor. Wealth flowed upward, pressure flowed downward. By 1700, New York had about 5,000 residents. By 1730, the number passed 8,000. Poor families formed a large share of this growth. Many were immigrants. English laborers arrived first. Later came Irish Protestants, Scots, Germans, and French Huguenots. Most arrived with little money. Many arrived already in debt. Indentured servitude increased. Poor adults signed contracts to work 4 to 7 years in exchange for passage. During this time, they had few rights. Masters controlled food, housing, and punishment. Families were often separated. Children were bound out early. City records show children as young as 7 placed into service. Officials believed work prevented crime. Parents had little choice. Hunger forced consent. Housing conditions worsened. Landlords divided houses into small rooms. Several families shared one building. Privacy disappeared. Illness spread fast. Fire remained a threat. In 1697, a major fire destroyed many homes near the waterfront. Poor families lost everything. Relief came slowly. Rebuilding favored merchants first. Food prices fluctuated. Grain shortages occurred in the 1690s and early 1700s. Poor families reduced meals. Bread quality dropped. Malnutrition weakened children. Women carried heavy burdens. Wives worked beside husbands. Widows faced severe hardship. English law allowed widows some rights, but property rarely existed. Many took in boarders or washed clothes for others. Taverns remained survival spaces. Women ran many of them. Authorities watched closely. Licenses cost money. Fines were common. Yet taverns fed families. Enslavement expanded sharply. By 1700, enslaved Africans made up nearly 20% of New York's population. By 1730, the number grew higher. Enslaved families lived under constant fear. Sales separated parents and children. Urban slavery differed from plantation slavery, but remained brutal. Enslaved people worked as dockhands, servants, artisans, and laborers. Some enslaved people hired out their labor. They paid a portion to owners. This allowed limited independence. It also shifted risk to the enslaved. Free black families existed. Their lives were fragile. Laws restricted movement, land ownership, and trade. In 1703, New York banned black people from inheriting property from whites. Poverty deepened. Church charity continued. Anglican, Dutch Reformed, and Presbyterian churches ran relief systems. Aid came as bread, firewood, or coins. Recipients were inspected. Morality mattered more than need. Begging was criminalized. In 1684 and later years, city laws punished public begging. Whipping, fines, and forced labor followed. Poverty became a legal issue. The city relied on forced labor. Poor men worked on roads, docks, and fortifications. Payment was low. Refusal led to jail. Debt prisons filled. Those who could not pay were confined. Families suffered outside. Wives begged quietly. Children worked longer hours. Health crises struck repeatedly. Yellow fever outbreaks appeared in the early 1700s. Poor neighborhoods suffered most. Burial records show spikes in child deaths. Medical care was scarce. Doctors charged fees. Poor families relied on home remedies. Churches sometimes paid for treatment, but funds were limited. The almshouse system began to form. In 1736, the city built its first formal almshouse. Planning began earlier. Officials wanted to house the poor, sick, and idle. The goal was control, not comfort. Almshouses separated families. Men, women, and children were housed apart. Work was mandatory. Conditions were harsh. Food was basic. Discipline was strict. Authorities believed poverty came from moral failure. This belief shaped policy. Aid was paired with punishment. Riots exposed tension. In 1712, an enslaved people uprising occurred. It was crushed violently. The response hardened laws. Curfews tightened. Fear increased. Poor white families also felt the impact. Surveillance grew. Night watches questioned movement. Poor neighborhoods faced suspicion. Economic shifts hurt laborers. As trade centralized, small craftsmen struggled. Wages stagnated. Rent rose. Women entered informal markets. They sold food, goods, and services without licenses. Authorities fined them. Survival required risk. Children filled the streets. Some sold items. Some ran errands. Some slept in doorways. Orphan numbers rose. Education remained rare. Charity schools existed but were limited. Most poor children could not read. This trapped them further. By the 1720s, poverty had a face. It was visible. Crowded streets, thin bodies, silent hunger. The city responded with order, not reform. The poor built the docks. They cleaned the streets. They carried goods. They buried the dead. Yet they remained unseen. By the 1730s, poverty in New York City was no longer quiet. It was loud. It was visible. It filled the streets. The city had grown to nearly 10,000 people. Trade increased. Ships crowded the harbor. Warehouses rose near the docks. Wealth became more concentrated. Poor families felt the pressure every day. Rent climbed faster than wages. A dock laborer earned little. A seamstress earned less. Food prices shifted without warning. One bad season could destroy a family. Housing conditions worsened. Landlords divided buildings again and again. One room held entire families. Windows were few. Air barely moved. Disease thrived. fire was a constant danger. In March 1741, a major fire broke out near the docks. It destroyed homes, shops, and warehouses. Poor families lost beds, tools, and clothing in hours. Many slept outside afterward. Fear followed the fire. That same year, the city faced what became known as the 1741 conspiracy trials. Authorities believed enslaved Africans and poor whites planned to burn the city and kill leaders. Evidence was weak. Panic ruled. More than 150 people were arrested. Many were poor. Many were enslaved. Trials moved fast. Confessions came through pressure and fear. By the end, at least 30 people were executed. 13 black men were burned at the stake. Others were hanged. Dozens were transported out of the colony. Families were destroyed. Children lost parents. Wives lost husbands. No compensation followed. Poverty deepened. The trials showed how fear targeted the poor first. Wealthy merchants faced no such danger. Power shaped truth. After 1741, control increased. Enslaved people faced stricter laws. Night gatherings were banned. Movement required permission. Punishment grew harsher. Free black families suffered as well. Work opportunities shrank. Surveillance increased. Poverty tightened its grip. White poor families also lived under suspicion. Taverns were watched. Boarding houses were inspected. Any sign of disorder brought punishment. War added strain. From 1744 to 1748, King George's War reached the colonies. New York supplied troops and materials. Taxes rose. Poor families paid through higher prices. Men left for military service. Some never returned. Widows increased. Children entered labor earlier. Supplies were diverted. Food became scarce at times. Hunger returned to many homes. Church aid struggled to keep pace. Donation lists show rising need. Relief could not match demand. The almshouse expanded. More poor were confined. Families were separated. Children were placed into service. Mothers had little say. Officials believed work cured poverty. They forced labor inside almshouses. Tasks included spinning, cleaning, and breaking stone. Pay was minimal or non-existent. Illness spread inside these institutions. Crowding worsened conditions. Death rates were high, especially among children. Yellow fever returned in outbreaks during the 1740s and 1750s. Poor neighborhoods suffered most. Burial records confirm sharp increases in deaths during summer months. Medical care remained limited. Doctors served those who paid. Poor families relied on charity or home treatment. Many died untreated. Women carried survival forward. They traded informally. They took laundry. They sold food. They nursed the sick. They buried children. Authorities fined them for unlicensed trade. Survival remained illegal. Children became essential workers. Boys hauled goods. Girls cleaned homes. Schooling remained rare. Illiteracy passed from parent to child. By the 1750s, the gap between rich and poor widened further. Merchant families lived in larger homes. Poor families crowded near the docks or northern edges of the city. Slavery continued to expand. By 1750, enslaved people made up about 1/5 of the city's population. Their labor powered the economy. Enslaved families remained unstable. Sale threatened unity at all times. Children grew knowing separation was likely. Some enslaved people earned small sums through extra labor. They bought food or clothing. Freedom remained distant. The French and Indian War began in 1754. New York became a supply hub. Soldiers filled the city. Prices rose again.
Poor families rented beds to soldiers. This brought income, but also disease and disorder. Authorities blamed the poor for resulting problems. Men were pressed into service. Families lost wage earners. Wives managed alone. Food shortages returned in certain years. Bread riots occurred in other colonies. In New York, fear kept unrest quieter, but no less real. By 1763, the war ended. Britain gained territory. Celebration followed among elites. Poor families saw little change. Debt increased. Taxes remained. Rents stayed high. The city stood at a turning point. Poverty had survived fire. It had survived fear. It had survived war.
But resentment grew beneath the surface. Poor families began to question fairness. They felt the weight of rules that protected wealth and punished need. This era shows how crisis exposed the city's values. When danger came, the poor paid first. When fear rose, the poor were blamed. When order returned, the poor were confined. After 1763, New York City entered a tense calm. The war had ended. The hunger had not. The rules stayed harsh. The city held about 18,000 people by the late 1760s. Growth did not ease poverty. It made it sharper. More ships arrived, more goods moved, more wealth gathered at the top. Poor families felt squeezed from all sides. Britain needed money after the Long War. Parliament passed new taxes. These laws reached deep into daily life. The poor felt them first. The Sugar Act of 1764 raised duties on imported goods. Sugar, molasses, and rum became more expensive. These were staples for working families. Prices rose, wages did not. The Stamp Act of 1765 taxed paper. Licenses, contracts, newspapers, and court papers now cost more. Poor people needed these items to work, marry, or defend themselves in court. Resistance grew fast in New York. Crowds formed. Dock workers, sailors, laborers, and apprentices joined protests. Many came from poor families. They knew these laws threatened survival. In November 1765, protesters shut down stamp distributors. Effigies were burned. Property was damaged. The anger was real and rooted in hunger. Elite leaders spoke of rights. Poor families spoke of bread. British troops arrived in 1766 to keep order. Soldiers camped in the city. This changed daily life. The Quartering Act required housing for soldiers. Wealthy citizens avoided hosting them. Poor families had fewer choices. Soldiers crowded into working-class neighborhoods. Rents rose again. Food supplies strained. Conflicts between civilians and soldiers became common. Poor women rented beds and rooms to soldiers to earn money. This brought income. It also brought risk. Fights and illness followed. The city tried to regulate prices. Enforcement failed. Speculators hoarded goods. Poor families paid more. Work remained unstable. Dock labor depended on shipping cycles. Winter brought unemployment. Almshouses filled during cold months. Children worked harder. Apprenticeships increased. Many children were bound out not for training, but for survival. Abuse was common. Slavery remained central. Enslaved labor built roads, loaded ships, cleaned homes, and served elites. Enslaved families lived under constant control. Some enslaved men joined protests quietly. Others listened and waited. Promises of freedom circulated but lacked proof. Free black families faced worsening conditions. Jobs declined. Racial restrictions tightened. Kidnapping remained a threat. Church aid continued but fell short. Donation lists show rising need. Relief did not meet demand. In 1769, non-importation agreements spread. Merchants agreed to boycott British goods. This aimed to pressure Parliament. Poor families felt mixed effects. Some local goods became cheaper, other items disappeared. Unemployment rose in certain trades. Tensions stayed high. In January 1770, violence broke out between soldiers and civilians. The Golden Hill incident occurred months before the Boston Massacre. New York streets ran with fear. Poor young men were often involved. They had little to lose. Authority responded with force. By the early 1770s, political talk filled taverns. These spaces mattered. Poor families owned or worked in many of them. Information spread here. Women listened, served, and spoke. Their labor sustained these places. Their opinions shaped households. The Tea Act of 1773 raised new alarms. Though tea taxes were lower, control increased. Poor families drank tea less than elites, but symbolism mattered. When news of the Boston Tea Party reached New York, crowds gathered. Ships carrying tea were turned away. Tension climbed. British authorities strengthened control. Surveillance increased. Meetings were watched. Poor families lived between sides. Supporting protest risked punishment. Supporting the crown risked community anger. Violence followed. In 1774, committees of safety formed. They enforced boycotts. They punished suspected loyalists. Poor people could be targeted easily. Debts became weapons. Accusations ruined lives. Food shortages worsened in some seasons. War rumors disrupted trade. Hoarding increased. Women managed households under strain. They stretched meals. They took extra work. They sent children to labor. By early 1776, war loomed. British troops fortified the city. Cannons lined streets. Tension filled the air. When fighting began in Massachusetts, New York stood divided. Poor families faced impossible choices. Joining the rebellion offered hope but no guarantee. Supporting Britain offered safety but risked revenge. Enslaved people faced their own choice. British officials hinted at freedom for those who fled rebel masters. This promise spread quietly. Families debated in whispers. By early 1776, the city braced for war. Prices rose sharply. Food grew scarce. Fear replaced protest. Poor families prepared as best they could. They stored what little they had. They hid savings. They stayed close to kin. History shows us that political change did not arrive cleanly. It arrived through kitchens, taverns, alleys, and beds shared for rent. Poor families shaped history without writing laws. They protested with bodies and voices. They paid the cost when order broke. In September 1776, New York City fell to British forces. The battle was brief. The consequences were long. The suffering was deep. For poor families, this was the hardest chapter yet. After the Battle of Long Island in August 1776, British troops marched into Manhattan. American forces withdrew. The city became the main British military base in North America. Nearly everything changed overnight. Thousands fled before the occupation. Wealthy patriots escaped first. Poor families had fewer options. Many stayed because they had nowhere to go. The city filled with soldiers, loyalists, refugees, and prisoners. The population swelled beyond what food supplies could support. On September 21, 1776, a massive fire broke out. It destroyed about 1/4 of the city. Hundreds of homes vanished. The fire hit working-class areas hardest. Poor families lost shelter, tools, clothing, and food stores. Many slept in ruins. British authorities suspected arson. No proof was ever found. Housing became scarce. Rents soared. British officers took the best buildings. Churches, schools, and public buildings were turned into barracks or prisons. Poor families crowded into remaining spaces. One room held many people. Disease spread fast. Food shortages became severe. Trade routes were disrupted. Prices rose sharply. Bread became scarce. Meat became rare. British authorities controlled supplies. Loyalists received preference. The poor waited last. Women stood in long lines for bread. Some waited hours only to be turned away. Children grew thin. Fuel shortages followed. Winter cold hit hard. Firewood prices rose beyond reach. Families burned furniture to survive. Work disappeared. The harbor closed to many ships. Trade collapsed. Dock labor declined. Artisans lost customers. British military contracts helped some. Tailors, laundresses, and laborers found work serving troops. Pay was low and irregular. Women became central to survival. They cooked, washed, mended, and sold food. They rented space to soldiers when possible. They negotiated constantly. Prostitution increased during occupation. Poverty drove some women into it. Disease and violence followed. Children worked everywhere they could. They carried water. They ran messages. They scavenged food. Schooling stopped entirely for most. Disease spread widely. Smallpox struck hard in 1776 and later years. British authorities carried out forced inoculations among troops. Civilians suffered without care. Hospitals were overcrowded. Poor families avoided them when possible. Death at home was common. Prisons filled the city. British ships in the harbor were turned into prison ships. Thousands of American prisoners were held under brutal conditions. Poor families visited imprisoned relatives when allowed. They brought food and blankets. Many watched loved ones die. Enslaved people faced critical choices. In 1775, British officials promised freedom to enslaved people who fled rebel masters and served the crown. This promise drew thousands. By 1783, about 3,000 black loyalists lived in New York City. Many lived in poverty. Freedom did not bring security. Enslaved families broke apart as people fled or were recaptured. British evacuation later scattered many again. Loyalist poor families also struggled. Support for the crown did not guarantee food or shelter. Loyalty did not fill stomachs. Crime increased. Theft became common. British patrols punished harshly. Public hangings occurred. Fear ruled the streets. Charity collapsed. Churches lost funds. Almshouses were overwhelmed. Relief barely existed. Burial records show rising death rates during the occupation years. Children died in high numbers. Winter deaths spiked. By 1781, the war shifted south. New York remained occupied but isolated. Supplies worsened. Families survived through networks. Neighbors shared food. Women formed support circles. Kinship mattered more than politics. When peace talks began in 1782, hope returned slowly. Prices remained high. Housing remained scarce. In November 1783, British forces finally evacuated New York. Loyalists fled with them. Black loyalists left in large numbers, many bound for Nova Scotia or the Caribbean. The city they left behind was damaged, poor, and exhausted. Poverty emerged from war with nothing saved. Homes were ruined. Tools were gone. Debts remained. Liberty was debated in halls. Survival was fought in kitchens and streets. Poor families did not choose war. War chose them. They endured occupation, hunger, fire, and loss. When the British left New York in November 1783, freedom arrived to a damaged city. Streets were broken. Homes were burned. Families were exhausted. Peace did not bring comfort. It brought uncertainty. New York City became part of a new nation, but poor families entered this new chapter with nothing saved and much lost. The population slowly returned. Refugees came back. Soldiers returned home. Freed people searched for work. By 1790, the city had about 33,000 residents. Poverty grew alongside growth. Housing was the first crisis. Thousands of buildings were damaged or destroyed during the war. Landlords rebuilt slowly. Rents rose sharply. Poor families crowded into unsafe structures. Cellars became homes. These spaces flooded easily. They lacked light and air. Disease spread fast. City leaders debated solutions. Property owners dominated decisions. Poor families had little voice. Work returned unevenly. The port reopened. Trade resumed. Merchants profited. Laborers faced low wages. Competition increased as more workers returned. Dock work remained unstable. Winter brought unemployment. Women's work remained informal and poorly paid. Widows from the war struggled greatly. Many lost husbands who never returned. Pensions were rare. Charity became their main support. Children continued to work early. Apprenticeships increased again. Abuse remained common. Oversight was weak. The city expanded almshouse use. Poor families were sent there in growing numbers. The goal remained control, not care. Inmates worked long hours. Families were separated. Discipline was strict. Illness spread inside. Free black families faced harsh limits. Slavery still existed in New York after independence. Gradual emancipation laws came later, not yet in force. Black laborers faced job discrimination. Wages were lower. Housing options were fewer. Kidnapping into slavery remained a threat. In 1787, free black leaders formed mutual aid societies. These groups helped members bury the dead, support widows, and care for children. Community became survival. Debts from before the war resurfaced. Courts reopened old cases. Families faced seizure of property. Jail returned for debtors. Taxes rose to pay war debts. Poor families paid through higher prices and fees. Food insecurity continued. Bad harvests in the late 1780s caused price spikes. Bread riots occurred in other cities. New York saw tension but avoided large unrest. Women led household survival. They took laundry, sewing, cooking, and vending. They negotiated daily with shopkeepers and landlords. Street vending expanded. Authorities fined vendors without licenses. Enforcement targeted poor women heavily. Public health remained weak. Yellow fever struck New York in 1795 and 1798. Poor neighborhoods suffered most. Death records show higher mortality among the working poor. Medical care remained limited. Doctors charged fees. Hospitals served few. Families cared for the sick at home. By 1800, New York City stood on the edge of rapid growth. Commerce expanded. Construction began. Wealth concentrated faster. Poor families remained trapped. They built the streets. They hauled the goods. They cleaned the homes. Yet their own homes remained fragile. By the year 1800, New York City stood at a threshold. The past was not gone. The future had not arrived. The poor were still waiting. The city now held more than 60,000 people. Ships crowded the harbor. Streets pushed northward. Construction reshaped the land. Wealth grew faster than at any earlier time. For poor families, this growth carried a familiar lesson. The city expanded. Their lives narrowed. Poverty had changed shape since the 1600s, but it had not loosened its grip. What began as survival in a small trading post had hardened into a system that shaped birth, work, illness, and death. Housing remained the clearest sign. Poor families lived in cellars, attics, rear houses, and subdivided rooms. City surveys from the late 1790s show rising numbers of people living below street level. Flooding, dampness, and rot were common. Landlords invested little in these spaces. Demand stayed high. Eviction came quickly when rent failed. Fire still haunted the poor. Wooden buildings filled working-class districts. One blaze could erase years of effort. Insurance protected property owners, not tenants. Work followed strict lines. Men labored on docks, in workshops, or on construction crews. Pay depended on season and health. Injury meant hunger. Women worked without protection. Laundry, sewing, cooking, and vending brought small income. Pregnancy ended work. Widowhood crushed stability. Illness shaped every decision. Yellow fever outbreaks in the 1790s proved a pattern. The disease struck hardest where poverty lived. Crowding, poor drainage, and weak nutrition increased risk. Middle and upper-class families fled north during outbreaks. Poor families stayed behind. They lacked options. Hospitals expanded slowly. Almshouses carried much of the burden. These institutions now held the elderly, disabled, sick, orphaned, and unemployed. Conditions inside remained harsh. Records show high death rates. Discipline replaced care. Families were separated by rule. The city believed poverty required order. Relief came with surveillance. Aid came with judgment. Assistance came with loss of freedom. Free black families faced deepening hardship. Though some slavery restrictions eased near the turn of the century, slavery still existed in New York. Free black workers faced job limits, lower pay, and housing discrimination. Black mutual aid societies grew stronger. Churches and fraternal groups provided burial funds, food, and care. Community became defense. Immigration increased again in the 1790s. Irish laborers arrived in larger numbers. Competition for work grew. Wages fell. Tension rose between poor groups. Authorities benefited from division. Poverty remained blamed on behavior, not structure. Debt laws still punished failure. Jail remained a threat. Families lost breadwinners to confinement. Political power stayed out of reach. Property rules blocked poor men from voting. Policy favored merchants and landowners. By 1800, patterns were clear. Poor families survived through networks, through women's labor, through children's work, through shared meals and shared grief. They learned when to stay quiet. They learned when to move. They learned how to endure without promises.